So I'm just going to start recording this, and oh, look at that. Right away, there's this record with a smart AI companion option. I don't know if I want that, especially when we're going to be talking about AI. Like, what is it going to do if it hears us? It's one of my favorite old jokes is that you should never anthropomorphize computers because they hate it when you do that. But I
Nice.
just want to get started. I'd like to welcome everyone who's joining us out there on the internet. My name is Mike Hoye. I work for a company called Pluralsight. And we're here today to talk about this ongoing rush of questions that we're getting from the world about adopting generative coding practices through AI and the various tools that are available now for that. And we're really interested in those questions and helping our clients through those questions. And the most fascinating part of that exercise for us is that everyone seems to believe that this is a really important thing to do. It's a powerful new tool. It's giving us a lot of new opportunities. But to take best advantage of those opportunities, how do we change our practices? How do we change our organization? How do we change our training? What do we need to become to be the organization that can take best advantage of these powerful new tools? And often those questions are a combination of imprecise, and there's a lot of anxiety there. People don't know yet what is on the far side of what is proving out to be a really major change. And so for us to be a part of that conversation and to help anyone who's listening with that, shape those decisions and decide what their organization maybe can be, I'd like to introduce you all to some of my colleagues, Dr. Kat Hicks, who's gracious enough to join us today, and David Farah, both of whom work with companies and do a lot of very fundamental research in the kind of questions we're hoping to adopt today, we're hoping to confront today as organizations navigate this really tectonic change in the way technology works in big organizations. And we'd like to be able to talk about not just the work that we're doing and the things that we've learned through our research, but how organizations can really best make what and the decisions they need to specifically make as they're learning what this new future looks like. Kat, you have some opinions about that, and we've learned a lot through your research. Do you want to take it from here?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike. And I appreciate the space to do this. This is such a fantastic conversation and topic. And I think you've made the point that we're all talking a lot about AI. But one of the things that my research lab thought about when we started our AI research was, it's amazing that we're not talking a lot about how people are feeling about AI. So I'm a psychologist. That's my background. I have a team of social scientists. We are really, really interested in understanding the people. And at Pluralsight, helping people kind of achieve their most innovative selves, learn together, upskill together. That's a thing that we care really, really deeply about. So when I decided that our research team was going to do a project on generative AI and how it was happening and being rolled out for software teams, that was at the heart of it. What is happening for people? How do these choices make them feel? And a part of that conversation is, of course, what do these new tools unlock? How does that change how I should spend my time, maybe as a software developer? But there's another layer of questions here that I think our research really speaks to, which is how are developers worrying or fearing about changing expectations for their roles? And sometimes those expectations are really uplifting, cool, amazing. Like, hey, I don't have to spend all of my time cranking out, syntax that I don't understand that well. I can actually get the superpowers of a tool to help me do that. I think that's a beautiful thing. But then there's also this really interesting journey teams are going on to understand, are people starting to have unreasonable expectations actually of what the state of this technology? And how do I tell my leaders, maybe what I'm discovering about the state of this technology? So that's something that in the Developer Success Lab, which is my team, we care really deeply about empowering that developer voice and trying to make sure developers, their insights, they are the people who are figuring out how we should code with AI. They're the ones doing it in their day-to-day jobs. And so our whole research project, which we call the New Developer, is about surfacing that developer's voice and their perspective on the current state with AI. So I don't know what you want to talk about there, Mike, but
Yeah. So
I
that
opened up the field
sorry.
with so many problems.
No, I think a couple big things you hit on there that I want to get into. So my research more or less is really working with people in their day to day, right?
Mhm.
So I work with the engineers on the ground, the leaders on the ground, and I think one of the biggest things you hit on was the expectation of what we expect from these tools and our developers and what this is going to do to our organization.
Mhm.
There is so much buzz around this right now, right? And everybody's going after it. I like to remember that every 8 to 10 months or so, there's another one of these buzzes that everyone's going after, right? And this is one of the things where like we have to A/B test how these things are working. And make sure that we can see what's going on and make sure that we're supporting our teams to make these things successful. And that's the biggest thing that I've encountered so far that I want to, dig into today with the two of you is the environment that we create.
Mm.
Doing this in the right way, making sure that we realize that this is just another tool, really powerful, but we have to have the right culture in place, the right expectations from our teams, and the right overall environment to get the results that we want out of it. Because it's not
Yeah.
magic, that's the thing is like if you don't. A lot of people, maybe if you haven't got into it enough or understand how it actually works, it feels like there's this magic element to it because it's AI, right? It's super smart, but there's more to it than that. And that's what I want to get into.
Let me just drop a few little pieces of data, right? Like we're very data-driven folks here.
Yeah.
We love the data and the evidence. So if you want to talk about what is the environment of software teams, in our research in the Developer Success Lab, we did a large-scale study with the Developer Thriving Project, over 12 different industries, more than 12, I think actually like 14 all told. And we measured how much developers felt like their technical work was visible and was valued, right, by their managers, by their peers. And we found some real gaps, right? A lot of developers felt like previous to AI, a lot of developers were already saying, I'm actually not 100% sure how my work is being seen in this organization. And so that's already like this kind of very important cultural piece for leaders to pay attention to. Another thing that popped into my head as you're talking, David, especially with your work, because I've seen you be so compassionate, with all of our customers and users on this, is we can say a lot of things about what we think our teams are doing, right? Like we can have a lot of really idealistic goals. And then
Yeah.
we get out, in our project, we were asking, hey, does your team use software metrics, for instance? And you know what the biggest category of response was from developers in our research?
Was it
It
I don't
was
know?
I don't
Oh,
know.
I don't
Yeah.
know. Oh,
I
Yeah.
don't know. It was a yes or no. Maybe one team I work with does and the other one doesn't, right? So there's like this chaos out there, this like
Yeah.
chaotic personal, like really disjointed usage that's happening across all tooling for software teams. And I think that it's a mistake to miss the fact that that could happen with AI.
I I think that it is. When you say it's a mistake to miss that it could happen, I think that the fact of it is that it's already very much happening, right? It's like if you haven't made a decision about how your organization should approach this class of tools and problems, that decision is already being made for you in your
Mm.
organization somewhere. You probably just can't see it yet. And I think that your point that you made about culture and compassion and the importance of those two things in a time of anxiety like this is really critical. I
Mhm.
think that, I mean, we can ask some very fundamental questions like, what is software really? Right? Software is an idea that you have taken out of your head somehow. It is your understanding of this thing you're working on that you've turned into a machine that tries to solve this problem. And if it comes out of your head, then your head should probably be an okay place to live if you want to do the best work you can do with software. And at a
Mhm.
time like this, when we're dealing with not only anxiety about the state of the industry, but also a big transition in the kinds of tools that we work on and work with, when we've often, like when as developers, we have often tied our sense of identity to our competency with those tools. And now the value of those tools in this state of profound flux, all of a sudden like the idea that the culture matters suddenly becomes wildly more important. The idea that the anxiety and trust within the organization matters suddenly becomes wildly more important than anyone expected it could be 5 years ago.
Mm.
Right? We've paid lip service to this idea for a really long time, but this is where the rubber meets the road, right?
I'll back
And
you up on that, Mike. Just from the empirical data perspective, again, we've measured, for software developers in our research project, we asked them, do you have the opportunity to learn as a team? Does your team really invest in something we call learning culture? And this is the stuff that often gets cut first. I mean, I think probably a lot of people listening can think about times in their workplaces. I certainly can think about across my career the feeling that, learning things, learning activities, they're sort of the optional or the nice to have. We found that this presence of learning culture, whether you have it or not, it really statistically significantly predicts how much those developers are struggling with AI and are worried about whether they're going to stay relevant. And what was amazing to me about this, it was a stronger predictor than experience. Is a stronger predictor than all kinds of things that we might also think probably matters for developers. So the cultural piece is not just like floating on top of all of this. It's really, really core to how the technology gets adopted.
There's something that both of you said there with the learning culture side, and Mike, you really brought me back to where when you talk about like what is software in itself, which sounds like a big question, but I think it's actually really important to think about in this context because taking our ideas and making them something that our customers want, right? Actually delivering something of value is something that we miss in the mechanics of these tools in the process, right? It's so often where, we get this really cool tool in our IDE and we can get, a function quickly or a command quickly, and this stuff starts building up. But in that kind of process, if you're not putting together, well, what's the ultimate design that I'm going for here? Like software and value for our customers is not just a bunch of functions that we put together, right? It's the ultimate goal of the entire thing we're trying to build. And I think that's, to me, the forefront of what's so important as we adopt these AI tools is that humans have to solve these problems. We still have to have our goals set, right? We have to know what we're going for. We have to be creative in how we put these things together so they're more efficient. We need to use these things to support us in the best ways we can. But solving these bigger problems and making sure that we're delivering is actually valuable, I think that all gets mixed up in the mechanics, and we really have to focus on that. And again, coming back to creating that environment, whether it's, learning from our mistakes and having that learning culture built into our day to day, and having all the right tools and teammates to work with. So much of it comes back to that. And to me, I think my point is, I just keep coming back to this is another tool, but keeping your eye on the end game for where you're trying to go is still, it's just so critical, especially now.
There's an insight from like across the psychological sciences where researchers who specialize in behavior change tell us in moments of transition, like those are moments of risk and opportunity, right? Which is
Yeah.
of course something that any business leader knows, but it's a moment of risk and opportunity not just for your business, but for this incredibly specialized, important workforce. Like we don't have enough people, right, who can build software in the world. And it's an incredibly difficult thing that we've asked folks to do. And we need to be building safety around those people, I think. And a moment of transition, which sometimes, kind of congeals around a tool almost, like the tool becomes the symbol, right, for this big identity change.
Right.
It's a moment when a lot of people in our industry are asking themselves, do I still belong here? Do other people worry about the things that I'm worried about? If I see a security risk with this AI tool, will my leaders care? And so one of the things, a story that springs to mind is when we were doing our research project, it was so important to us to listen to developers, to not just be like the scientists in the ivory tower, on this. And we held these, what we called pre-mortems, if you know a pre-mortem ritual where you sit down and you kind of imagine, the worst possible scenarios. And I remember worrying a little bit like, hey, am I asking people to do something that's very anxiety provoking? Sit down and imagine the absolute worst thing that could happen
Oh,
when your software team adopts AI. But we believe very strongly, like as social scientists, that you actually, if you can face these things together and you can do it before the bad things happen, and you can do it in a place that you've made really safe, you've said, we're going to come together and do this, something really good will happen from it. And we did indeed observe that. We had people sit down, software developers at many different levels, and go through a structured pre-mortem exercise and ask themselves, okay, let's imagine it's a year from now, we've adopted, Gen AI throughout our engineering organization. What are my deepest fears about it? And no matter how much you think you're the only one, get it out on the table and share it. And people did. We facilitated these pre-mortems, and it was just the most beautiful, cool experience for folks. Multiple people had never imagined the kind of risks that other people were talking about, but suddenly they were all out on the table and we were able to talk about them together. So that's the kind of conversation that I love to see happen inside of engineering orgs, but I'm not sure if everyone is getting there yet.
I feel like your research, I'm sorry, Mike. I feel like the way you conducted that experiment is almost like a microcosm of what we should be doing in our organizations.
I
Like kind
appreciate
of
that.
taking away the fear of the unknown by saying, hey, we're just going to try this. Right. Because I feel like there's so much buzz going on. Everyone's like, oh my God, like they have the anxiety, like I have to try this out, but they don't have the opportunity to. So just providing that space so you can even get in and mess with it, see what it's going to be, and probably learn that it's not that intimidating what these tools are actually doing. Like I feel like that's so important for, taking just how we did this research, but also how it can apply to your teams. I'm sorry, Mike.
no, not at all. The idea that it has to happen at the team level too is
Yes,
unbelievably important.
critical.
Mhm.
Yeah.
We talk about mutual trust as engineering leaders, and people have for years, but it is so rare to find these situations where, like, an exercise where we can teach each other how to trust each other
Mhm.
is an actual part of our management practices, a part of our leadership practices as engineers, as managers and directors, particularly. And this idea that we will, in those conversations, not only find all of these things that we share as a team, all of these anxieties we share as a team, but all of those outliers as well, all of those new perspectives about things that worry about us, that we can also then, like, we can start taking those things into account when we plan our teams, when we plan our projects. Um, we don't need to just run people for 60 or 80-hour weeks for a couple of months and then pretend that throwing a pizza party at them will fix anything at the end of that exercise, right? We can plan to work with humans from day one in a way that treats each of those people as an individual human trying to solve a difficult problem together, right? And
Could you
we
imagine coming into a pull request blind and not knowing that your peer was using a Gen AI tool?
Mm.
Like it's probably going to look different than what you would normally look at with them, right? But then going into it, knowing that they're using something like that, you're probably going to look at it with a different lens as well.
and a lens where you can talk about both what the machine is doing and how the human is, responding to that input,
Yeah.
changing their perspective on that. Um, Knowing the working environment that you're in gives you a very different perspective.
Mm.
And knowing, like, being able to understand as a member of a team that these decisions are being made on these terms, it does take out a lot of the social risk of conversations, right? The idea that you can have a conversation that is suddenly not a threat to that person's identity, right? But we have a different way of talking to each other, knowing that those conversations are being, part of those conversations are tool assisted, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
What's coming to my mind with this is when I imagine, like, here's the developer, here's the pull request between us, here's someone on the other side invisible. I'm not quite sure how you worked, right? Like embedded in that is this sort of invisibility, right? We're going right back to the fact that we're not sure how the rest of we're all working. And are you using these tools in one way and I'm using them in another? Something I'd like to point out about this is that not everybody responds to that situation in the same way, because not everybody is allowed to respond in that situation in the same way. So what I mean is, we see some large group differences in who is feeling really able to use AI tools, who is feeling like they can use them without any fear of repercussion or fear of judgment. There's a lot of complicated things happening here. Something that struck me in our research project on this is women on software teams are much more likely to be the only person on a team where the whole team is using AI and the woman says, I'm not using AI actually. Now, there's a lot to dive into about, people's different perceptions about AI or, risks that people identify, rightfully so, with some of these tools. But I also think that when you see patterns like this, like my opinion as a scientist about it is this like team incongruence, we called it. That's a real signal that in this like chaotic tool adoption, things are not happening equitably, right? Like not everybody is feeling like I'm actually allowed to use this tool to free up all this time, or if I do, I'll be seen as not a competent engineer, right? Y'all know that my partner teaches at a university as well, and they're seeing this across the students. Some students are thinking to themselves, this is the best thing ever. I can now generate all of my code. I'm going to use this freely and without remorse, sometimes too much, right? And we're all on that journey learning, like, how do we do it? But some students actually, I think this has gone a little bit underappreciated. A lot of students are very, very fearful about using AI, and they're potentially going to fall
Interesting.
behind because they're so afraid of doing the wrong thing or being seen as doing the wrong thing, right? Even if they're actually allowed to. So it's a very complicated story out there, right?
And if you were working on a software project and you saw that one side or one corner case, one edge case in this program was behaving in a term, like we use the term pathological, which is a deeply unfair way to describe a lot of things. But in software, occasionally we had edge cases that behave very differently than the main cases. If you, as a developer, were just going to overlook that, right, and just say, oh, it's not a big deal, forget about it, you would in some ways have failed the profession, right? By not having enough curiosity to look into why things are different in these particular cases. But we're so often willing to do that with people, right?
Yeah.
For whatever reason, out of fear or anxiety or preconceived notions of bigotries, then we don't dig into why people are different. And then we end up with these horrible cases where systems that treat everybody on a project as being interchangeable. Like the default setting for systems that treat
Yeah.
people interchangeable is that when you put pressure on a system like that, they start to treat people as disposable, right? And that is understandably also, particularly in an industry that has just put so many people in the streets in the last year, uh, an equally serious cause for anxiety around adoption. Do I or don't I? Like, and how
Yeah.
am I perceived in doing so?
We describe
Tim,
this. Oh, sorry, David.
no, sorry. Go ahead, Kat.
Thank you. We describe this thing in our research. We call it contest culture, right? There's like this very well described kind of culture in a lot of STEM fields, and engineering is a part of it. I think software engineering has a lot of very interesting different things going on in it, culturally speaking. So it's a generalization. But we tried to measure contest culture. And contest culture is when you feel like, in order to belong in this place, in order to be a person who's like, I'm one of you, I'm like a good software developer, I have to continually like prove my technical expertise in sort of a really competitive contest way. That is
Yeah.
not the only way to do this work, right? So we contrast that with what we call a thriving culture, a culture that doesn't ask you to constantly reprove and have these sort of engage in these like competitive contests. And that was a big differentiator for people. Like if people were inside of a contest culture, they felt like I'm approaching the entire question of AI tools completely differently, like from the perspective of assuming I'm going to be misunderstood, assuming that like I might be seen as irrelevant later. And that those problems are just not arising in the same way for people who have a better culture around them. Go ahead, David. What were you
E-
thinking?
Everything that we're saying, and you're hitting on again, like every point that we're saying brings me back to setting the right environment from the beginning.
Mhm.
Like Mike, you brought early on about, these conversations are already happening. So, and if we don't address it now, like it's gonna, go wild without you, and it could very well go the wrong direction. So I think to me, if we take anything out of this today, it's like this is time to talk about it. Whether or not you think your organization is ready from a risk and security perspective, whatever it is, it's now's the time to address it and talk about, the pros and cons and how to do it in the right way. One of the things that you guys got me thinking about, people that took place in this research and how organizations have gone through this, some of the fear. I thought back to the first time I used one of these tools, right? Just Chat GPT. And I kind of like, as you were going through it, I was like, well, yeah, the first time I did this, I didn't know if it was the right thing to do, because what about data leakage? I can't take, information that's proprietary to my organization and put it in this tool. So like I thought through that process, I was like, okay, well, if I take out some of these names, I could use this and see what it spits out. So I did a little mini experiment and I was like, oh, this can be really helpful.
Mm.
So again, this was just my experiments, but I feel like that's what we need to do with our teams. To say like, hey, try it out in a safe way, see what it does. Obviously we have to be careful not to share proprietary information in the places we can if we're not set up with, licenses for something that's in our environment yet, and you're just trying it somewhere else. Like, have these safe spaces where you can test it out, work on prompt engineering, understand what that is, and, kind of back to, we have to create the learning culture. We have to create this space where people feel they can learn about these things, get into the right topics, and then, we create the stage to get the most out of these things.
I think that what we've seen, and Kat, I think you've seen this in some of the data as well, is particularly around seniority and the adoption of these tools as well. We've seen how people with a great deal of experience can leverage these tools very effectively, whereas people who are just getting started out in their careers often get led into the weeds by the spicy autocomplete, as it's sometimes called pejoratively. But I think that even that environment, even in that context, there's still an opportunity for well-functioning teams that are working together, that are doing pair programming, that are doing code review together, for people who are able to take better advantage of these tools, to be able to sit with junior developers and say, look, this is what I'm seeing, right? These are the places where I'm making adjustments because I've got this new mechanical partner who is effectively like kind of a decent pair programmer who just never gets tired and who's always available whenever I need them. Whereas a
Depends
junior
on the language
developer,
you're working in, how decent it is. Yeah.
Oh, true.
Yeah, it's been an AI copilot tools. The copilot tools have recently been described to me as like pair programming with an okay engineer who's kind of looking at their phone, right? So while they're helping you.
Yeah.
Which is to say that there is a benefit there. There is something there that is adding a lot of value to this exercise. It's not going to be exactly what you want, and it takes a little bit of coaxing sometimes to get the real value out of it. But that doesn't mean it's not there, right? It just means that it's going to be of different utility to different people at different moments in their lives, in their careers, in their contexts. And being able to ask questions about what those differences are, which people, to whom are we talking, is going to be in a lot of ways the key differentiating sort of effort between, I think, teams and organizations to help everyone on those teams get the most out of them.
I so agree with that, Mike. I am going to challenge a few things you said just because that's really fun to do, right? And so I think that you're so right. Some of my background is learning science, right? So I'm really interested in, hey, how is it, what are the differences between experts and beginners? How do you learn to do expert thinking? Can we get some people there faster, right? Like those are a lot of the questions that we're concerned with when we talk about skill development. However, there were some very interesting things that we were surprised by in our research. So one example of this is experience level, and we have a very large sample in our new developer study, so we were actually able to look at a lot of group differences, which I was really proud of the team for, because we recruited a lot to get that sample. And that allowed us to ask, is there this difference for seniority? Do really experienced engineers feel a lot less anxiety about the future when they think about AI being adopted in software? And that is not the case. So
Really?
even though I think you're probably right that they have a very different skill set to brain, and we've heard enough in other research about the fact that they can triage better. There's a lot of specific tasks with AI. I completely agree with that seniors are going to be able to kind of, get into and help their teams with and should play an important role there. However, I just want to make the point that this culture stuff really goes across the board. It's affecting leaders, it's affecting managers, it's affecting ICs, and it might be affecting them differently. Like they might be saying, well, I'm really worried about the future of AI because I'm not sure how to help a team that's working with AI, right? Their focus of their tasks might be different. But I just thought that was very surprising to me. I actually expected us to see, we had, a hypothesis in our mind that we would find all the juniors really in need of help. And I think juniors always should be our focus. Um, but that was really, really interesting. And I think that something that this tells me, again, is that how our organizations adopt AI go very deep for people into their beliefs about who they are as developers. And, we told this little story that was like in our research paper, like imagine someone who's not sure about AI. Imagine a developer, they're in this moment with us, at the time in the fall of 2023. They're not sure how they feel about it, and they're watching their team adopt it. In one culture, in the contest culture, this person keeps their worries to themselves. And they have these moments of their day. I'm a good example of this because I'm not a full-time software developer, but I write a lot of code to do statistics. And there's certain things that I just don't always know that I don't know. Like creating data visualizations is a great example for me. And I got into the AI tooling, right? And started to do things like say, well, let me give you my bad code, and then ask you, can I make this better? Is there a new package people use that I haven't learned about? How do I change the fonts? Because honestly, the whole font thing is so difficult. So there were these little tasks I started to identify for myself that were so amazing. But you could imagine if you go to that story in our paper, we imagine this developer who doesn't have anyone to talk to about those little experiments, right? And so the people around them don't learn about the experiments. The developer themselves might actually notice something that's a huge deal. Like, oh, the quality that we're getting out of this tool is actually so much worse than we're all saying it is. Am I the only one who notices how wrong it is? Am I the only one who's worried about getting like 10 times the amount of code to review from other people that's now like generated and our code review practices are falling down? you know, if we don't surface those really important pieces of feedback from our teams, we're not going to triage the situation very well. So there's the heart-centered, hey, we must help the people who don't always have the skills piece of it. But to me, there's also the incredibly important part of this, which is some of these people have the skills to diagnose really serious problems and they're there to do it. And we're not there to do it as leaders. And how foolish of us to leave all that insight on the ground, right?
Well, I saw a couple times now. My observations are not as scientific as yours, so I don't have enough data points to prove all the things I'm saying.
Real
But
life is scientific, David.
okay, the two things that I saw, like with the senior engineer example that you're using there, the ones that really jumped out at me were, one, I saw that there were a bunch of pilots where people were just giving it to senior engineers to prove out if it was
Mm,
going to help them or not, and they were given the wrong context.
I
They're
hate
saying like,
that.
"Hey, we want to prove that this tool works." So those senior engineers went out of their way to make it work, to show how much more they could do with it, right? Versus the other case of
Mm,
like, "Hey guys, we want you to try this out, see how it helps the team," that type of thing. I saw a couple of those situations where the senior engineers were like, "Well, I already know how to do this. This is giving me crap. This is a waste of time. I'm not going to use it." So like setting that context for why you even want to introduce these
mm.
things and have that conversation the way you're teeing it up, just so important.
That's
And
so interesting that you can set people up where only one answer is possible. You're like,
Yeah,
hey,
right.
vet this tool and find all the reasons that it's gonna work.
Right.
Um, yeah, that's
yep.
so interesting. And a point that I've made before in my research on how software teams learn together is that it's a mistake to divide everybody up. and say, well, seniors learn one way and juniors learn another way, and our Q&A people learn one way, and our, whatever beliefs we have about different engineering jobs. Because there's like a thing that happens when people are together, right? And something that I really believe that we said in our paper as well is like, listen, software teams have strengths to lean on, and they are the right strengths for this time. We already know about pair programming. We already know about, the importance of coming together to hold a very honest postmortem or premortem where we allow ourselves to look at the bad and the good, right? And we need to bring that mindset here.
Absolutely.
I think that it's, I feel like we are on the verge of that change. And I don't know how. I would love to have a sort of high level, 1,000-foot perspective of what it looks like when this idea of human engagement with the tools and with each other becomes the dominant practice, becomes the thing that we understand that we have to grow and build in an organization as a priority, as opposed to just hiring people, throwing them at a problem, and giving them a ball pit or something if they look like they're feeling down. As a practice,
a ball pit would be even more investment than a pizza party. So
it would. You see,
One
that's
step
how you
up.
can tell. That's how you can tell that we really care about our people, right? It's not the ball pit. That's what's important. No, and it is astounding, I think, in my experience, how often the recognition of people as individuals and as participation in a team outweighs anything else as far as their considerations, as far as their motivations, as far as their mood and sense of engagement go. People will crawl over broken glass for a sticker that says they were a part of this team, right? But if you offered them $1,000 bonus, they would be insulted, right? And that's not universally true, right? That's true for comfortable people, relatively privileged people. And again, we need to keep putting individual people as individuals at the center of this exercise. But I would love to get us to a point where that is the default setting for this industry, right? Where the AI tools that we're adopting are something that are adopted with the human at the wheel in mind, right? Where the team as a cohesive, functioning entity together in mind. It's a beautiful possible future. And like Kat, to your credit, the data we're finding is pointing that way, right? The more data we get about this, the more we find out that actually the human is really important, right? And not in aggregate or anything like that, but as an empowered individual, as part of an empowered team, right? The reduction of anxiety is a practice of management that is rewarding and valuable in and of itself. And adopting AI, I think that AI is a way, like deployed well, I think it's a way for us to get there. Like as a consulting AI as a check on our practices, like does this look like it makes sense? If we're doing it like that, it's a different tool than it is if we just want to pour lines of code into our code review process, right?
It is like the ultimate challenge to the production model of a software engineer. Like you can no longer, I think that's why it's so scary. You will never be able to outgrind algorithmic generation, and so you must define yourself as something different, right? Than someone who can work on all-nighter and grind out a ton of code. Like that's just never gonna win this race. And I think that people are on different points of that journey. And I hear even incredibly accomplished senior, leaders, engineering leaders, right, who have still had to go through that very painful journey where they were judged on lines of code, the stuff that we all say we don't want to use and that isn't a good measure. And yet, when we go around and we ask engineers, do you think people judge you by lines of code? A lot of them say, I think probably somewhere. Maybe there's that, I don't know, feeling about it, right? But it's still a pervasive feeling in our industry, even with all that we know. And so I think AI is not just about AI. It really is about like, what are we going to choose as the way that we look at what a successful software team is?
So how about we bring this home? Well, let's all throw our hook out there of what we got from today, because I think this is great conversation. I think we could probably go all day, and maybe we break it up with a few more chats. Um, I'll start with mine. I think it was really helpful for me to talk through these cases with the both of you, and I bring it back to the environment's number one. We set the right context for how we use these things. We create space for our teams to experiment and learn, actually learn, right? There is new technology, there's new things that you need to spend the time to actually train and learn how to do. Um, then figure out how you're going to measure it. How are we going to do that A/B test? What is it that we're going to look at, before the experiment, during the experiment, see if we got the value out of it. And then finally, my what I've been saying to others as we've gone through these pilots is that this is just another tool. This is not going to change the world. You need to leverage it to go get the most out of it. But I likened it to carpentry because I build furniture. So I can give you the best router, but if you don't know how to build a cabinet, that router is not going to help you. So you need to have the right context. You need to know what you're building and put it together. That's my hook. Out, and maybe Mike, you go, and then Kat, you can bring us home.
So I think it's part of the saying it's the right hook. It's just a tool. I think that there's some truth to that, but I think that in this space where so many of us have defined our identities around our tools and around our competencies with these tools, I feel like there's something more there. And in a period of transition like this, where clearly like there's some people able to leverage these, some people not, some people who feel that they are empowered to do so, some people who don't. And those, like per Kat's data, and I accept your remarks about seniority in particular. I will. You have said that you've got data, so I need to change what I think about that if that's what the data says.
You know what? My stance is always going to be more research is always needed. So happy to go do that research.
I feel obligated always to say, look, I've learned something from the data, so I've changed my opinion, right? And one of the things I think that is most important in this space is that getting that data, like David, you mentioned, getting the data, really understanding the data is really important. Being willing to be honest and change because of what you see in that data is really important. And that as a whole practice, that is the difference between having change happen with you and your team and your company and your organization, or just having that change happen to you, right? And we can talk about trust, we can talk about collaboration, all of those things, but we also need to remember that all of that falls under one broad category of agency, right? Of being able to take the reins of the future as it's shaping up and really, take that on as a leader for your organization and try and make the organization a better place for the individual humans in it as the use of this tool changes how we work. Which leaves me to hand it over to our empiricist. Kat, how do you want to tie this one off?
Sure. Despite the role I occupy as a scientist in this room right now, I'm going to tell you very personally, like doing research on this was scary for me and my team, right? And it was scary because not that we didn't think we had important things to say, we did, but it is such an important topic for software teams. And we went into this research saying, we're not 100% sure what we want to say about how software teams should use AI, because we don't even know what software teams mean when they say using AI, right? So what we came out of it with, I think, is one of the pieces of research that I'm the most proud of. And so I guess I share that just to tell you, if you're listening to this, or you're a leader, you're like, this all sounds really nice, but it's really, really scary and hard to think, am I going to go tell my teams to do a pre-mortem where they tell me everything that could go wrong with the tool that I just spent our budget on? I know this is really hard, but I think that if you can take that leap and be brave about it, that is what people will see. And that is where people will meet you. And that's what we found across many, many teams and many, many developers, that people have a lot they want to say about this, and they might know a little bit more than we do, actually. So if you can kind of build the room for them to come into and allow them to have that conversation, you will certainly be giving yourself access to to insight, before lots of other people. I think the other piece of this that I would say that came out of this conversation for me is like the importance of the personal. You know, I just shared my own experience doing this research, and I feel that to face massive industry changing things, we need to look at the person next to us and say like, hey, what's happening for you? How are we doing this? How are we doing this on this team? And not get so caught up in like, you know, the industry analyst report about this, but say, okay, what journey is my organization on? And so how do I make that journey one step better with this stuff?
And that is a beautiful note to end this off on. Thank you very much. Oh, I got all the way through this talk without flubbing a line, but here I am. Couldn't quite get it over the line. Thank you very much for all of you joining us for this and for having this conversation. I'm going to get this cleaned up. We'll get it up on the internet for people to see it, and I hope it'll be of interest to them. It's been fascinating for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you both.
Thank you.